Hi, I'm BJ Williams, and I'm glad you joined us tonight for this special Read About It program. We have a group of Oklahoma authors. We are celebrating our heritage with Oklahoma writers, and they're going to be talking about writing in Oklahoma. I would like to introduce the group. First, we have Diane Curtis Regan and Carol Hamilton, Stanley Hoig, and Molly Griffiths. And Carol, what's it like to be a writer here in Oklahoma?
Well, I have a perspective on it because I lived away for 15 years and I started writing when I lived in another part of the country. And when I first came back to Oklahoma, it seemed to me that there was a lot of vitality here. That because it's a young state and there's not a tradition, and there seemed to be a lot of openness. It's a nice place to write because there's a lot of support from other writers, and we have many writers groups that are very active, several very important writing programs at the universities in creative studies, and the short course at OU is very well known. But to me, I think the land and our history affect our writing somewhat too. I think writers here are very independent as well as interconnected. And also the abruptness of our weather and our history kind of affect how we relate to each other and to our work as well, perhaps. I don't know if anyone else has experienced that or not.
Well, I see Oklahoma has many things, but I see largely the western aspects of Oklahoma, largely I guess because I work mainly in that area. But I came out of the old pulp area. I started writing when people were writing pulp stories. And many of my friends who are writers are people who got their start in pulps. One in the stage of Glenn Shirley, a good friend of mine. But I had the honor of meeting Walter Campbell and introducing him to the Writers Club at Oklahoma State when I was going there. And that points directly to the old writing program that existed at OU and still exists at OU, which did so much to get a large cadre of Oklahoma writers started in a lot of different fields. The writing program there was very successful. But also the clubs that you have in various cities. I belong to Stillwater Writers Club, and as has been mentioned, the support of other people is so helpful in getting young writers interested in getting them thinking professionally about being published.
I think mentioning the writing school, Dwight Swain and Foster Harris, sort of were the mentors for many, many of us. I know that they were both my mentors when I was in school at OU, and that has done a lot for the state. Foster at one time, I think, had all 4 short stories in the Saturday Evening Post were students of his, and that's back in the time when they were paying big bucks for that kind of
that's
thing.
A tradition that is just, you hear about it when you first come back and continue to hear about it.
Of course, that was the Mecca, the Saturday Evening Post.
Right.
That was back in the dark ages, wasn't it?
Back when short stories really
It was pretty dark back then.
Well, one of the things that I have heard is that people have actually moved here to Oklahoma, either to take the course at OU or because they've heard they want to write this particular kind of writing, and they found there's a really strong group here that does that sort of thing, and they've actually moved here because they think that it would help them write better.
Of course, a lot of the other institutions now have good writing programs. The Governor Central State and a number of the other schools have good writing programs also.
I know when we put on conferences, we draw people from all the states around us in because they know we put on good conferences.
For one thing, Texans come up here for our
All those
conferences,
Texans.
which is kind of unusual. They don't like to admit it, but
And
they
when
do.
I lived in Texas, I used to drive to Oklahoma City to go to the conferences, yes.
Well, one of the things that these groups do provide is some of that information that you don't learn in creative writing. You can be a great writer, but in today's market, you also have to be something of a business person, and you have to know how to sell yourself. And I understand that you can pick up a lot of tips from some of these writers groups working on that.
Yes, publishing has become rather more difficult simply because of the amount of competition there is today. All these publishers are inundated with manuscripts, and it's you have to know how to get their attention and how to sell yourself, as you say.
Diane is an expert at that. Perhaps she can share some of her
I
tips.
have a good agent, is what I have. But well, when we have workshops, we provide lots of market information. Of course, when people come, even if they just started writing, all their questions are about marketing. How do you do this? And the truth is, they're putting the cart before the horse, because what they need to do is learn the craft of writing by taking classes from Carol or someone like that, and then worry about marketing. So the writing does come first.
Well, Diane, I'm intrigued by this new area that I've just found out. Because I knew you as a young adult, and tell me about these books again.
Aren't I still a young adult? She means young adult books, I'm sure.
That's what I meant
I did.
to say.
I'm working my way down. I started out writing young adult books, and then wrote for younger kids, and then toddlers, and now I'm down to baby books. But it's a little bit different for me. So I think writers have to keep themselves entertained, and you don't want to write the same thing over and over again. So that's why we change.
Well, and I understand that being able to talk with other writers, you're holed up in your room or glued to your computer or your big chief notebook, if you're a lead pencil person. And it's nice to get out and talk with somebody that has the same experience as far as being holed up. And this is something you can count on here in Oklahoma, because we have an awful lot of writers, I understand.
The group that you all have in Edmond, the Children's Writing Group, what is the name of it? I just recently...
We have a very active chapter of the Oklahoma chapter of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, which is a national organization. And we have 2 workshops coming up this fall, and one is a critique session, and people love that because they can bring their work and we read it and go over it, and you really learn a lot. And the second workshop is a workshop with Mike Wimmer, who's a wonderful illustrator in Norman, and then next year we'll be putting on a one-day conference next spring. So we do a lot here for children's book writers.
And the University Center in Tulsa had, I think, the first celebration of writers this year, which was a huge success.
That was a mind-boggler to me of the
Right.
number of people
Yeah.
when they had that autograph party. Because there were people there that I did not realize were Oklahomans, and I thought I recognized most names, but that was really impressive.
I understand.
And we honored Essie Hinton, who's probably the best-known children's book author in Oklahoma, a legend actually. And so it was nice for her to come out, and I think there were 400 to 500 people in the audience that night. So she was well-deserved honor.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we have something more than children's writers. I just realized that all 4 of you actually do children's books, but Oklahoma has a little bit more than that to offer, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah. I have the books that I did when I started publishing were all adult books. The Heck Thomas, My Papa, one of the first, and Bonnie Spear has done a new version of that now that is really, really wonderful. He was a sheriff, a marshal, U.S. Deputy Marshal, and yeah, we have such a varied history. And that Stan has written, Stan's book, The Run of '89, to me is the ultimate book on Oklahoma history, because he found stories that nobody else knew about.
Well, thank you, Molly, but there are a lot of good subjects on Oklahoma, and they're extremely appealing. The Oklahoma Run of 1889 with David L. Payne was a tremendous character.
Sure.
The Indian Battle we had, Battle of Washita, which Custer was involved in. We have a great deal of history in Oklahoma that really hadn't been written thoroughly yet, and I think there's some good writers coming along today that are doing that.
Well, Harold Keith's book that won the Newbery, Mr. Keith is the one that everybody always knows with Oklahoma. I learned from that when I was talking to him, there was a home in Ardmore that was just for Civil War veterans, and that's where he did his research. See, that book won the Newbery in '58, and so he had researched it much before that. So there were these Southern Civil War veterans at an Ardmore home. So we had a source, and of course Wadey being the only Indian general from the Civil War and the last one to surrender. You're right. We have.
And I think Oklahoma history is almost, as Dan said, it's almost untapped. We haven't really exploited it, and there's just a rich wealth of information and stories over at the Historical Society.
Yeah, that's true. And we of course, we hadn't mentioned the tremendous depth we have in Indian history. There's so many tribes here that have great stories about them. I recently did a book on the Trail of Tears, a subject that's been written about on a juvenile level a lot, but never has really been studied very much. And it's extremely fascinating getting into the background of these different tribes and how they got here and the personalities they had. The Cherokees has many interesting personalities. You can do a whole series book just on the leaders they had.
And there's a lot of other ethnic history as well because of the run. We have Czechs in Yukon. We have that the Kalachi Festival, and there seems to be an awful lot of people from really all over the world who have somehow ended up in Oklahoma. And apparently at least one of every one of them wants to become a writer. So.
We've been talking in the last year, especially, I think, since the bombing, and I think Oklahomans have just been trying to explore a little bit what our makeup is. We hadn't really thought of ourselves as a people too much. And after that experience, we felt drawn together and realized we have a character, and we wanted to know what caused this. And I think a lot of writers are trying to understand a little more of how we are a people. And throughout our literary history, regionalism has really played a big part, and I think we're just beginning to explore and maybe find out what our regionalism is.
Yeah, in connection to that, I'd like to mention too that some of the historical resources that we have in Oklahoma that offer unlimited research anymore compared to what was available, say, 30, 40 years ago. The Oklahoma University Western History Collection has a marvelous collection of material. The Oklahoma Historical Society, as you mentioned, is extremely good. You wouldn't believe it, but at Central State, we have enormous resources in terms of microfilm of newspapers. The book I did on the run of 1889 on David L. Payne, a lot of that material came from Kansas newspapers. So much of our history came in through Kansas. Mm-hmm. And we also have a good supply of Arkansas newspapers. And these early day newspapers are fascinating reading in themselves. One thing that struck me so much about it is that in reading the narratives that people wrote during the 19th century, I'm appalled at how poor a writer I am compared to these people. These people were good descriptive writers. Some of the narratives you find the military officers wrote, or people who made the run and so forth, are just really fascinating reading themselves.
I'm glad he mentioned that Western history, because the Indian and pioneer papers that are there that a lot of people aren't aware of, they have things in the 20s and 30s. The WPA sent people out to interview all the people in Oklahoma. And here I live in Norman. I did not know they had an interview with my grandfather done in 1930 in which he gave names, family names and dates that we had not recorded any place. And since they're computerized now, you go up and you tell them the family name and they can find if your people were interviewed. And this was a job for writers. Again, coming back to what we did, that they did here in Oklahoma. Writers couldn't make money, so they hired them to, the artists to paint the post offices. You know, the Indians, the Kiowa Five did the post offices, and then they hired Oklahoma writers to go out and interview everybody who had either been in the land run or come in the early 1900s.
Didn't Angie Dabo do some of that WPA writing?
It may be that our heritage through the Native Americans has something to do with the rich tradition of writing here, because so many that came over the Trail of Tears, they were well educated, and we had some wonderful early poets, Alexander Posey and some of the others, and they valued education. And our last poet laureate, who was our poet laureate for many years and is now emeritus, Maggie Culver Fry, she remembers her whole family encouraging her from when she was very, very young in her Cherokee heritage with her poetry. So I think we have a rich background of valuing. And they had those early newspapers, the Phoenix, the Cherokees.
Well, the Cherokees were particularly interesting. And they, from the very beginning, wanted to prove themselves equal intellectually to the white man. And so they established the institutions of education they had, the seminaries, the male and female seminaries, and sent quite a few of the children off to Eastern schools. And they had graduates of Princeton and so on, you know. So they were people who looked to the intellectual, the ability to express yourselves intellectually and to write and to focus upon, to defend the culture in parts, you know.
Well, I think also just the tradition of storytelling that a lot of the Indian groups have brought, because most books are stories. I mean, that's what you're telling a story, and we've got this really going, you know, several hundred years back that you do tell stories.
And storytelling as an art is really thriving in Oklahoma as well. Winter Tales has been going on for a number of years now, and it's considered one of the best in the country. And in fact, the nationally known storytellers here in Oklahoma say that the others from other parts of the country just can't wait to get an invitation to come to this one because it has a wonderful reputation. So.
And a number of those storytellers have written books, and they've been on. I have to put in a plug for Read About It. But that's another thing that I think helps writers here in Oklahoma. We have a lot of very good bookstores that are not national. They're independent bookstores who really support our writers. You can't go into one without seeing a big Oklahoma writers shelf, or usually it's a whole bookcase because there's so many, and you can find anything there. Children's books, history books, mysteries, suspense, science fiction, romance, you name it. And we've got, what, 5 or 6 people at least who are writing it.
And we have very supportive libraries. I have to add that too. They are very, very supportive.
That's true. I've learned to appreciate libraries much more than when I was an undergraduate. I always remember when I was in Houston one time, I ran into B.B. Chapman, the historian from Oklahoma State, in the library, and he was there on a convention, and he was on lunch hour browsing the library, and I thought, boy, what an old fuddy day, you know, spend all his time down here going through a library in this big town where everything's going on. And now I do it all the time myself.
Well, libraries know a lot of writers because we have them in the libraries. They're the ones that call up and ask the questions, that come down and spend several days in there researching sometimes just one little tiny facet of a book. And even here in Oklahoma City, we've had people from all over the state, actually from out of state, that end up at the library doing some research, and we often
There's a lot more information disseminated out than there used to be. Nowadays, we have tremendous resources in microfilm, and one that I've called on a great deal is the Indian series they have at OU in the Western History Collection. They have all the agency papers, the Cherokees and the Choctaws and Cheyenne, Rappos, and so on. And that's a vast amount of, it's all the correspondence that is accumulated, letters received, letters sent, and so on. And there's a great deal of history in those. And first-hand history rather than secondary history. As you get into writing these books on history, you can depend upon secondary sources, or you can go to primary sources. And I think too often we tend to go to secondary sources because it's the easiest way to get the information. But if you really want to find out a lot of times what really happened, you need to go to the primary source and make your own interpretation of what really happened, what was said and written, and so on. And sometimes it's not the same.
Right. Sometimes you can find 5 or 6 different versions of what happened
you sure can.
in the secondaries. Well, one of the things that, and I'm hoping later on in the year to interview the people who edited this, but when you mentioned WPA, they also went out and collected slave narratives, because we had a lot of freedmen who came to Oklahoma to start life over again, and a number of them were still alive in the 20s and 30s, and so we've got a very nice collection of stories about what it was like to be a slave in the South.
There's a book published recently, you know, a couple from Texas wrote a book on the from the letters in Oklahoma Historical Society. I had seen those, but it didn't occur to me to do a book on them. Mm-hmm. But they were marvelous letters about slaves who came with the some who came with the Cherokees and others. And they're a whole slice of American life that you never see elsewhere.
I think we were good at preserving stuff. You know, I think early on, our founders were really big on saving the newspapers and all that sort of thing. I think we were real lucky to have, you spoke of librarians, the Historical Society too, it seems to me, have gone really out of their way to preserve Oklahoma history, knowing that it was so different from any other state, the way that we started.
Well, and they have the living legend tapes in the basement of the Historical Society too, where they go out and interview people who are over 90 years old, and many of them were here back in the very earliest days of statehood, and you can get some wonderful stories on those as well.
Well, the everyday newspapers are pretty interesting. A lot of small town papers are on such a personal level. You know, you had personal tidbits about people, and you had a much better record about what went on in that town than you have in today's newspaper, which tend to take things off the wire a lot more. You know?
The Apache newspaper still says Mrs. Nye Johnson received a long-distance phone call from
Yeah.
Houston, Texas on her birthday. That's still. I love it.
And she didn't call that in, did
No,
she?
that's right. The neighbors heard about it.
Another thing I don't think we've talked about is the participation of the public schools. As an old school teacher, I think of that, but I think all of us have probably spent a lot of time visiting schools, and they're very interested in having authors, but they also carry on a very lively program of creative writing with the students. And we've had students win the Young Authors series and had their books published all over the state, different ones. I think the competition in the future is going to be even tougher than it is today, because I've judged a lot of poetry contests from the young people, and wonderful things are coming out.
I judged a contest one time that had Indian poetry of Indian children, and there was some really good stuff in it.
Yeah,
Really
it's
good.
amazing what young people are doing.
Of course, they had the Native American had a special quality in expressing himself anyhow, because he did it in such earthly terms. And some of the old speeches are just marvelous. The way the Indians expressed themselves and told their story. It's a language all its own.
I noticed that too. I think it was at Medicine Lodge, one of the chiefs got up to speak, and it was just like poetry coming out of his mouth, and it just amazed me to read. They didn't have a written language, but they spoke
Was
as if it were.
Chief Joseph's line from this day on.
From where the sun is at this
from where the sun
moment,
now says,
I will fight no
we'll
more
fight no
forever.
more.
Say that again.
From where the sun is at this moment, I will fight no more forever. They were about to annihilate his people, and that's kind of become a shibboleth for them, you know.
Well, we have a lot of other things for the kids. We've got Quartz Mountain, and I think there's a conference or a get-together in Broken Arrow, which is young kids. So
I've done that
UConn
before.
has one every year.
Do they-
And so
UConn
many
does?
of these are on Saturdays, and it absolutely amazes me to go on a Saturday and at 8 in the morning the school is full of children ready to write, and it's just overwhelming because often children don't want to go back to school on Saturday.
I seem to remember feeling
I
that
do
way.
too.
Of course, we didn't have poetry contests and that sort of thing when I was in school. So this, and I suspect that part of this flows simply from the fact that there are so many writers here. We don't have to look and try to find somebody to come on Saturday morning, because we've got really, we're spoiled for choice. For adults, and I'm sure some of us are waiting to sign them up in the Illustrating and Writing for Children Society, and I'm sorry I mangled that name, but Mystery Writers, the Oklahoma Writers Federation, and so on are just waiting.
On television that an English teacher was having his students, and they were elementary students, write critiques of books and put them on the internet. And it stimulated the kids to do this. They were really interested in doing it because what they did was going to be published, it would be seen. You see.
Yeah, that seems to be the thing that somehow, some way, you have to get something published, because until then, it's just a real struggle. And that one time, but I think that's part of what the groups, the clubs do, is keep your nose to the grindstone till you do get published.
Well, you're a writer, whether you've been published or not, if you are writing, but a lot of people feel they need the validity to have something published before they can tell anybody that they're a writer. Right. But if you write, you're a writer.
Well, speaking as a non-writer, you know, if somebody says, well, I'm a writer, then my first question is, what books do you have out? Although I've learned not to ask that since I deal with so many writers now.
when I did the last little group, I have a book called Love Letters to a Pot-Bellied Stove. And with little ones, we had the kids do love letters to their school, you know, with memories and everything. And one of the third graders wrote, "Way back when I was in kindergarten."
Back in the
She
old
was
days.
serious. I just loved it, you know. But I was having them do their memories of the school.
And you'll probably have one or two of those people wondering why you aren't back in the publishing business when they get out of college.
Exactly, right, right. Well, I've done 18 Oklahoma books, and I have felt like with every one of them that it's contributed some other little place, you know, to Oklahoma history that had not been recorded before. And that's what we depend on people like these guys to do, to tell us so that we can get it down.
Well, there's an awful lot here then for a writer.
Yeah.
Well, so writing is such a diversified field. It's almost too broad a term. There's so many different ways to write, so many different things to write about, so many different fields to specialize in, and which is, I've always thought, one of the first things a young writer needs to learn. He really needs to specialize. He needs to direct his attention into some specific field. And that doesn't mean that's the only thing he needs to do, but he needs to find an area in which to concentrate his efforts and develop his skills towards one particular goal in one market.
And they have to read. That's the only way
have
to
to read.
learn. To write is to read.
Well, and then to go and have it critiqued when
That's
you
right.
get through with it. Well, I want to thank you all very much for being with us. We're out of time. Let me reintroduce you and then tell everybody about what's coming up next week. We've had Diane Curtis Regan, Carol Hamilton, Stanley Hoig, and Molly Griffiths. And next week we will have some writers from the Tulsa area, William Bernhardt, Charles Sasser, Teresa Miller, and Manley Johnson. We'll be talking about writing in Oklahoma. Be sure and see us next week.